And I stopped the transcription too. So let me start with a question. What comes to your mind when we say development, regardless of the context? I mean, here we're talking about development of human beings, but in general, or within this context, what is development in your mind? Improvement, good. What else? As you see, I drink gallons of stuff. Changing, that also is a good way of looking at the whole process. Very nice. When it comes to improving, I will put a small asterisk footnote behind it, under it, because it's not always for the betterment. Getting something new, see, this is much more on point, and growth is also very much relevant too. But when we need to think about development, we need to focus on the concept of change, as Baal suggested, changes of things. These changes are usually progressive. So it's about increase in skill and capacity for the betterment of the organism. That being said, while it's usually defined in this term, it's not always like that. As we grow older, we develop too, but that development is not for the betterment, that change is not for the betterment of the organism, but it's making the organism unable to perform certain tasks and certain issues. It's a lifelong process. It does not stop. That also is a misconception that we think development or developmental processes are all the way up to 18 years, and then afterwards it's much more stagnant. No. See, when you're trying to understand the impact of how much you develop, you gotta make a quantitative comparison. What does this mean? A child develops very fast. Why? Because let's say we talk about a 3-year-old child. Over the course of age 3 and age 4, this kid has actually accumulated more than 30% of her life. So the increase is 30%. We're talking about changes, in comparing to 3 years and then 1 year, it's a huge progress. 4 years and 1 year, we're talking about a 25% of increase in life and experiences. Whereas I'm 47 years old, and let's say for the sake of the argument, I am 50. For me, a 30% of development is 15 years. So the development a child experiences between the age 3 and 4 is an equivalent of the development I experience between the age 50 and 65. Do you understand what I mean by this? Adults do develop. We continue to develop, but it's much slower. So that's why we talk about periods of 5 years, 10 years. You look back let's say you're 40 years old, you look back to your 30s and you see that you're a very different person. Physically speaking, mentally speaking, psychologically, socially speaking, because from 30 to 40, again, you have gained more than 1/3 of your entire life. So this is the main point. The longer you live, the slower development becomes and less visible. And the changes when we talk about development can be about the structure, physical structure, about the thinking processes, or the behavior of an animal. I'm going to say an animal rather than a person, which is both affected by biological genetic factors as well as environmental influences. There is always an order in development, and you cannot really change that order. You can increase the pace, or some certain genetic setups might make you go through certain stages faster or slower, but the order never change. You don't start running before you learn how to crawl and then how to walk. It is practically impossible. All of these, learning how to crawl and then moving on to walking and moving on to running, might happen, let's say, within the scope of 3 months, which is highly unexpected but not impossible. But this order is permanent. And you can measure physical development. You can even measure mental, cognitive development to a certain extent. So we're much more talking about a qualitative change in functioning. Development investigates the processes that lead to age-related changes and the transition process between successive, birbirini takip eden developmental stages. So development is mostly defined in stages, while there are exceptional theorists and thinkers who say these stages are not really existent in every culture. There are certain other elements to it, but most of the classical developmental theories focus on a stage-wise growth. And this knowledge is very necessary, from deciding curriculum to parenting styles, from designing toys for children to uh, entertainment for children. Everything is inspired by these developmental elements. So what we're going to talk about in this semester is, first, we're going to start with physical development. Then we'll move on to cognitive development. Then we'll move on to personal, and lastly, we'll move on to social development. So in personal, we'll talk about moral development is somewhere between cognitive versus personal. And Freud is very individualistic in that sense as well. Erickson, however, is pretty about psychosocial development. And when it comes to cognition, we'll primarily focus on uh, Piaget and Vygotsky. A development is a result of a combination of the concepts of growth and maturation. Growth and maturation does not mean the same thing. Growth is quantitative. So it's developing from a simpler form to a more complex form, to a smaller form to a bigger form. It's about changes in the physical sizes of the body, growth of the head, growth of the, torso, getting longer, getting fatter. All of these are about growth. So we talk about an increase in size, in number, in strength, body strength, physical strength, muscle strength. And it can be measured by classical measurement elements. Whereas maturation, büyüme ve olgunlaşma. Whereas maturation is about more qualitative changes that usually happen naturally and spontaneously. Uh, it's like we are wired for certain milestones in maturation process. So they are, to a large extent, genetically programmed. And they emerge over time. You don't see a kid waking up one day and showing a much mature behavior than they were doing the other day, but you see it as a slow growing, maturating process. So we're talking about an increase in the child's competence and adaptability, in the child's thinking, in the child's reactions. And maturation is also very hereditary too. There are certain debates in developmental sciences that has been going on for centuries after centuries. Nature versus nurture, continuity versus discontinuity, domain general versus domain specific intelligence, knowledge, and universal versus context specific approaches. This one, the nature versus nurture one, is the most famous one. It has been debated since Plato and Aristotle. It has been an argument for centuries after centuries. So our qualities, our cognitive strength, our intelligence, our size and weight, to what extent these are hereditarian, which means these are the result of genetic upbringing, and to what extent these are the result of environmental factors. I am very, very sorry. This is all about the antihistaminic pills I'm taking. It has nothing to do with the course, nothing to do with you. It's just as talking is too difficult for me today. So, to what extent we acquire this knowledge as a result of our experiences? And the answer is actually both of them are influential. If we were to make a comparison, unfortunately, hereditary factors are slightly a little bit more influential than the environmental factors, like 55 to 45. But this is pretty much of a ignorable difference. So heredity determines the boundaries of your performance on any topic. So let's say this is the limits of your height, the limits of your intelligence whatsoever, which means regardless of how horrible the conditions are, you're not going to perform below this point. And also, regardless of how great and enhanced and enriched experiences you are being exposed to, you can perform to this level and not more. Where we are going to end on this continuum is totally environmental. These limits, these sidelines, are genetic, are hereditary, but to what extent we are going to fulfill our potential, that is purely environmental. Another famous debate is knowledge, is intelligence domain specific or domain general? Alana özgü veya alana özgü değil. So those who believe intelligence is domain general, learning is domain general, development is domain general, they believe that people develop a global knowledge structure which contains cohesive, whole knowledge internalized from experience. So we're talking about the concept of, let's say, a crystallized intelligence. These domains of knowledge are therefore interdependent, which means they are influenced by each other. They take elements from each other because they are not exclusive to a certain area. And if you're trained in one domain, you might pretty much well be training in another domain as well. This is my stance, by the way. But saying this, please, that shouldn't make you think and feel in the same way as me. Let me underline this fact for my courses. You don't have to agree with me on any issue, unless we are talking about factual information that has been proven by various studies. Let's say female students are discriminated in the classroom, knowingly or unknowingly. Women are paid less, from 10% to 30%, depending on the country. These are results of data collected from people all over the world. These are facts. These are not debatable. I don't believe girls are discriminated in the classroom. It doesn't matter what you believe. We are not talking about faith here. We are talking about a fact, such as 2 plus 2 equals 4. I mean, you may choose to not believe in gravitational force and assume you can fly, but when you jump, you're going to see that you're going to fall. Your faith is not going to stop you from falling. However, the interpretation of these facts, the cause and effect relationships, what is the reason for this to happen, these are always open to debate. You can have all kinds of your own ideas and opinions. We can debate on them as long as you're using a logical structure in your argumentation and you have a consistency within yourself. As long as you do this, you don't have to agree with me on anything. For gender, it's easier to agree upon. Most of the times we have these kind of debates when it comes to queer people. There are quite a lot of people who believe queerness is happening because there's just too much exposure to queerness. So people see it and then people are inspired by it. Let me tell you one thing. If you can become, let's say, gay or lesbian just by wanting, I would have been a lesbian already. Because understanding and communicating and having a stable, relationship with a guy is much more difficult than having it with a girl. For me, I'm talking about. So I thought about it, but it doesn't work that way. It's all about attraction, which comes from a much more genetic background. And therefore, I mean, I have seen gay people who have been the prince of their homes, like, treated with the leader as the leader of the family in a very masculine way. And they act in the social life in a very masculine way. But deep down inside, they are gays. So, what I'm meaning is, you don't, this is also not debatable, this is also a fact. You don't just look at, queer people and say, oh, I want to be like them. You may try, but you're going to see that it's going to fail. If it doesn't, it means you have it in you. This is as straightforward as it is. But of course, living a queer life, experiencing, going through queer experiences, that is very contextual and very cultural. It doesn't happen all by itself. So we were talking about domain general elements. I also kind of believe that knowledge and intelligence is domain general. It is called crystallized intelligence. So it means if you are an intelligent person, you will perform intelligently on every task, even on the tasks that you have very little talent, because skills, talent, and intelligence are different things. You may be very intelligent in a certain area, but you might have very little skills in another area. Your intelligence will tell you how to compensate your lack of skills in that area. Intelligent people would find ways to adapt, would find ways to compensate for whatever they are lacking. Stupid people, and I'm going to say it, less intelligent people, they just can't do it. I have seen artists, I have seen, sports people who are very intelligent, therefore they have used their arts and abilities and fame in very logical, very rational ways because they were intelligent as a sports person and they were intelligent as a person individually. So they knew what to invest in, how to maintain their life standards. And then I know some very stupid ones who go up and down and who lose all their fame because they don't really understand what they have done to get to the point they are anyway. Jean Piaget, Jean, which is going to be one of our best friends this semester, believes that we form cohesive knowledge structures and they are all connected to each other. We connect them in our synapses, in our mind, and knowledge is somehow becomes a spread of activation. By contrast, core knowledge theorists believe that we have highly specialized functions that are independent of one another. So training in one domain may not really impact another domain. Domains are interdependent. The multiple intelligences theory, which is pretty much debunked right now, was based on this very premise. Not everyone can be intelligent on topics that are more valued. So you can perform intelligence, at least this is what the multiple intelligence theories say, in a kinesthetic sense, let's say be a great dancer, in an artistic sense, and that should also be counted as intelligence. But even Gardner himself, the founder of the theory in his last years, came to the conclusion that those are less of intelligences and more of traits and abilities. So being highly skilled in an area does not necessarily mean you are very intelligent, neither in that area or in other areas. It just means you are talented. Another thing about knowledge, learning, development, does it have a sociocultural context, or is it universal at every place of the world? So, to what extent the developmental elements are identical in every part of the world, so accurate for everyone, and to what extent cultural contexts are influential about it. So when we talk about Piaget, we're also going to talk about Vygotsky. And this is the point where they are separated. Piaget believes development is universal. Every kid from every nation goes through the same problems, resolve them at similar times, and move on to the next stage. But I'm more of a Vygotskian, and I know that the sociocultural experiences, the environment, is a very, very, very important determinant when it comes to which areas are going to, which cognitive areas, which physical areas are going to grow much faster than the other ones. So the sociocultural context is pretty important. What do we mean by the sociocultural context? First of all, the immediate environment, attachment, parenting styles, the family itself. Then the local environment, the broader family, peers, teachers, we learn so much from them. And then the cultural environment, language, number system, customs. For example, Turkish is a non-gender language. We don't have a he or she, we just have an o. And it covers animals, it covers humans, and it doesn't really refer to the uh, person in a certain gender. Also, I have heard something in near times and I found the idea fascinating. A linguist has said that Turks are very patient you can understand just by looking at it to their semantics, how the order and syntax, how the order of the sentences are organized. Because in Turkish, it starts with the object, the person, then it goes with the subject, and the verb comes last. So the action taking is the last part. First of all, we talk about who is going to take, who is going to deal with what, and then that dealing thing is, what do we mean by that? But in English language, it's the object and then the verb, and the details come later. Even this changes the way we approach the world, the way we look at the world. If you're living in, vast, endless, frozen lands like Eskimo kids, your understanding of three-dimensional space, your understanding of snow, your understanding of sense of finding your way in the middle of nowhere will develop much faster than a city child. It doesn't mean one of them is more important, more intelligent than the other. It just means one had more opportunities in the cultural sense. And how do children become so different than each other, even when they are raised in the same family? I think of my own family. My brother is everything that I am not. I mean, of course, I'm exaggerating. We share certain common elements in terms of morality, in terms of intelligence, in terms of, obeying rules and caring for the welfare of others to a certain extent. But I'm a very social person. I have always been a social kid, and he was that kid who would run away in the, room back and cry when someone came to the house as a guest. I mean, it is very interesting. I mean, I started talking, and when I talk about talking, I'm talking about telegraphic speech, like the person and the verb, rather than, extending the sentence because that's too much of a mental operation. But generally, we expect telegraphic speech at around 18 months. I was performing it when I was 10 months. But you also expect a 10-month child to be standing alone in a sturdy way, even pulling themselves up. But I have pictures from that time that I'm laying on my tummy, or I am tied to a couch from my belly so that I wouldn't fall and not being able to go up, but I would still be talking while all of these are happening. My brother started walking by 10 months, started running by 11 months, but we had to take him to speech therapy to complete and, generalize or keep it on par with his peers. Two kids, two extremely different personalities raised by the same people. So, what are the sources of this variation? Genetics and environment, of course. These are all very influential. And do we stay the same over time? No. I was much more of an extroverted and talkative kid when I was young, but as I grow older, my introversion grew. And uh, same happened in the other way around with my brother. He was much more distant when he was young. He's still a very distant person, but he is as able to establish a certain amount of social relationships. And the last debate is development continuous or discontinuous? In what ways? The quantitative changes. So this is a growth of a pine tree. It grows continuously. This is the growth of a caterpillar into a butterfly. There are stages for that. Continuity of development focuses on cumulative changes. So it's about growth in scale size. It's about growth in number of vocabulary. It's about growth in body length. But the discontinuous way of development is about development involving very distinct, very specific stages. And once you pass and complete one of them, you move on to the second one. So from crawling to walking to running we talk about the discontinuity of development. It doesn't happen all together at once. Let me give a small break and take a breath, and then we'll carry on with the general principles of development. See you in 10 or 15, I don't know. Hi, everyone. I do my best, but I'm not getting any better. So I will carry on as well as I could, and then I will end it at some point. Okay. So whichever developmental area we're talking about, there are certain general principles. To begin with, people develop at different rates, especially when one side of development goes really fast, the other sides might seem to stagnate just to give enough space for the body to deal with that element of development. And also, in every classroom, in every environment, there will be people with different skills, different abilities. Some will be more coordinated and mature in a certain area, but not in certain areas. So it is very normal. That's why we talk about ranges when it comes to development rather than direct, actual uh, timeline for, okay, this is going to happen at 3 months. No, we say we expect this to happen between the 3 months and the 6 months because some kids are faster and some kids are slower. Development is relatively orderly. So you don't walk before you sit. You don't start talking about algebra before you learn about addition. So there has to be a cumulative, successive element to development. And development takes place gradually. I mean, you can make it maybe a little bit faster and enhance it, enrich it, but unlike the parents, most of the parents of today think, you cannot just make it rushed and you cannot just dump information on the minds of the child, expecting him to absorb them all. It doesn't happen that way. Development continues from simple to complex and general to specific. So forget about the Latin terms. You need to understand that we begin development, the sequence of development is direction of development is from head to toe and from inward to outward. So like this, which practically means first and foremost, we learn how to hold our head, how to move our head independently because little babies, when you have a really small baby, you need to hold their heads. Unless you do that, it's just going to fall from this place to another one. But eventually babies would be able to lift their heads or just jump them on your face, which means they're able to use their neck. Afterwards their torso develop. These are the times when babies are able to turn while they are sleeping, or they would be able to lift themselves up, or they would be able to sit up. And then the legs, when the legs develop properly, we can talk about beginning of walking. And lastly, the feet. So at the beginning of the walking, you're going to see it's going to be very wobbly. But later on, the kid will learn to take more proper steps because we'll have more control over their feet. Same happens to inward to outward thing. First of all, we learn how to control the muscles in our body so that we turn around. Then we learn to use the strength in our shoulders, then the elbows, and then the wrists, and the last part comes the hand and the fingers. So when we're talking about ability to use your arms, we talk about gross motor skills, whereas when we talk about being able to write, we talk about fine motor skills. There are critical periods for growth and development. If a child passes that critical period but has not shown any sign of development in that given area, you might be suspicious about a genetic disorder, a problem, and also compensating that might be very difficult. Different parts of our body, different parts of our personality will develop at different rates. And as we said, it's a lifespan process. So, development of the brain. Brain is a fantastic and very mysterious organ we have. I had this cousin who had a concussion as a result of falling down. And it was such a hard concussion that he had to stay in the hospital in intensive care in coma for like 2 weeks. And after he got proper better a little bit, both of his parents were doctors, so they said they could take great care of him at home. He came home. And after he came home, a couple of days later, we went to visit him. And that's when I really understood how brain is working and how fantastic that whole working process is. You know, there's this thing called lateralization. Like there are two hemispheres in the brain. For a very long time, people believe special visual information is handled in the right brain and the verbal information is handled in the left brain. But this also is another myth that is debunked. This kid, cousin of mine, was very fluent. I mean, not just know, but very fluent in English, in German, and in Turkish. And however, there were certain parts of the brain that were still swollen, and they were waiting for those swellings to go down. So he would point this because he want to drink water. He can't say, I want to drink water. He knows that this is to drink water. He shows it and says, can I have the chair? But he was able to form this sentence perfectly well in German. There was no problem. So, what does this mean? What do you think this means? Yes, Botir.
Maybe his brain has. You said the two hemispheres, and maybe even though he thinks that he wants to drink water, his another hemisphere was telling another. I mean, while maybe one wanna say that actually maybe his body wants to drink water, but his conscious, subconscious, or saying that he wanted to say take its chair.
Yes, and I'm saying that is exactly what it is. So his body wants to drink water. He knows he wants to drink water, but he says, can you pass me the chair? In Turkish. But in German, he was able to say, can I have a glass of water? So what does this mean? I mean, what do you
Is
think
it
this
is
means?
it about Broca's and Wernicke's areas?
Is it about? Uh, uh,
Broca
uh,
Wernicke's areas, maybe.
so, are there any thoughts, any opinions, any other ideas regarding this? Guys, this simply means a very straightforward task like talking a language, your native language, by the way, is done by activation. of various sources, various parts of your brain, which means we store the meanings of objects in one part, the names of those objects in another part, the grammar of sentence in another part, and we do this differently for different languages. So the meaning, the word itself, and the semantic of German was stored in a place where there was no swelling, no harm. So he was very straightforward in explaining himself. But when it came to the part of the, I am very sorry. When it came to the part of the Turkish language, probably those parts were swollen, and therefore he needed some more time to gain his proper Turkish back. I mean, the meaning was intact and the semantics was intact. The syntax of the sentence was intact, but the part where he stored the words themselves was still swollen. So even when you are trying to form a very simple language sentence called I want water, you are activating a large variety of your brain. And if you want to say bir bardak su alabilir miyim, that is whole another place. So nearly in any task, the hemispheres work together. The information in the brain is transmitted between the hemispheres and all brain cells in one hemisphere by neurons. Neurons store information and transfer information from one synapse to the other. The synapses are gaps between the neurons. The problem with the neurons is, unlike other cells in our body, they don't renew themselves. Once you lose a neuron, it's gone. There is a definite amount of neurons in our minds. So this is also probably why, and it's a beauty of evolution, that our skull is the hardest bone to break. I mean, this is the strongest bone in our entire body. And it is very difficult to open a space, let's say, in the brain in order to operate on the brain because the brain itself is very fragile. That being said, how do concussions happen? It is fragile, but when you fall down somewhere, when you hit your head somewhere, the brain begins to, hit the walls of the skull and loses some of the neurons. And it kind of makes the entire functioning process of the brain problematic. Because, yes, if your heart doesn't pump blood, you die. If your lungs do not get air, you die. But practically, all of these tasks and instructions and directions to these organs are given by the brain. So brain is the everything that makes all parts of the body work together. This is why you can be quadriplegic, just like Stephen Hawking's, that, right below your neck, nothing might be working, but you might still be functional as long as your brain is up and active. So while neurons do not increase themselves, the synapses, the gaps, grow bigger in order to store more information until the end of adolescence. This is why people say kids are like sponges and they just learn things very fast, but it also ends up us as parents being very much fascinated with this idea and dumping too much information on the kids without giving them enough time to understand those. So kids have an idea about a lot of things, but they really don't know many things. So growth of these synaptic gaps can be enhanced, but not as fast as most contemporary parents think. Another thing about neurons is that they live as long as they are used. Just like some parts of your body, if you don't use them for a very long time, they go numb and dysfunctional. This is why we tell the elderly people to walk, to do tasks as much as they can on their own, or to solve puzzles, to go out and talk people, to do their own shopping, because all of these things are the things that keep neurons in the brain activated. So if you are hesitating to ask a specific food from your grandma because it's too complicated, please don't. Just ask it. Make them do it for you. Because cooking a very complicated, like, something that requires involvement of gross motor skills, fine motor skills, cognitive skills, social skills, will make them happy to begin with because you ask them something and they still feel they, serve a purpose. And two, they are actually very much able to perform these tasks, but they generally fear. But when a grandchild asks, that fear goes away. And it helps eye and hand coordination. It helps memory because they need to remember the recipe. It helps fine and gross motor skills because they have to do a lot of things with their hands and their arms. This is why we tell elderly people to solve puzzles, crossword puzzles, because it helps their vocabulary and mental skills alive. If your grandma is watching, if your grandpa is watching too much TV, it's okay, let them do. Encourage them to read books, read newspapers, to join activities that their peers are there so they can have something common to talk. All of these things keep the mental neurons activated, so dementia, Alzheimer's, and all other brain stuff problems that occur in the late life will come much later. I'm not going to get into these periods of development other than the prenatal development. The later parts will be talking about them extensively. The human conception begins when a sperm penetrates an ovum, an egg of a female. When these two combine, a complete set of genetic instructions is formed, half coming from the dad, half coming from the mom. And this fertilized egg, which we're talking about something microscopic, is called a zygote. It is not life. It is not a fetus. It is not a human being. It's just a cluster of cells. And genes are the basic unit of these chromosomes. Chromosomes are made up of genes. So they are the molecules of DNA that hold all the information, genetic information of every cell in our body. Just by being able to take a scan, a map of your chromosomal structure, your gene structure, you can foresee whether or not certain uh, illnesses are up and coming, or what kind of problems you might be facing, or what kind of assets you have in our body. Every standard human has 23 pairs of chromosomes. And in these 23 pairs, one come from the mom, one come from the dad. People with Down syndrome, they have a 24th one. And this makes them abnormal. Telling these people that they are different and abnormal does not humiliate them. On the contrary, when you try to act that they are just like us, you are kind of hesitating to organize the environment for their welfare, which is much more of a burden on them. So, what we need to change is not the name of the disability, is not the concept of disability, but what we associate, the meanings we associate with a disability. Because we are all disabled in certain ways. I am very much disabled when it comes to orientation, map reading, understanding directions and whatsoever. I mean, it's just too difficult for me. My brain doesn't work that way. Three-dimensional spatial understanding is pretty low for me. And this is a disability because most people are not like that. So this whole normalcy thing and abnormalcy thing can be attributed to just genetic instructions. And when you attribute a neutral name to these issues, to these things, to these differences, actually calling them as an abnormality, that wouldn't really sound that much. We are all different anyway. How do our sexes determined? By the 23rd pair. Females have two X-shaped chromosomes and males have one X, one Y-shaped chromosomes. So the development of the Y chromosome, so the development of the Y chromosome, let me find people whose microphone is open. Okay, mute participant, I did. So if in this ovum, I am very sorry, the Y chromosome develops, then we have a male child. If it's the X, then we have a female child. So as you understand, keep on giving birth to female kids, where in many Middle Eastern countries becomes a problem for families, is not about the ladies, the moms. It's entirely about the dads and the sperm they are producing. That is the reality. You cannot blame the ladies for this. Sometimes the growing cluster of these cells break apart at some point, and we end up having two clusters of the same genetic structure. So these are called identical monozygotic twins because they are formed from one single zygote. They may have itsy bitsy tiny differences in their physical appearance, but their genetic structure is absolutely identical. Every single chromosome and everything. However, in fraternal twins, we talk about fertilization of two eggs at the same time. So two sperms fertilize two eggs in a female's body. We have more than one egg. We are not chickens. And, ladies who have their periods would know that it cannot be just one egg we are trying to get rid of. So if two of those eggs are fertilized, then we have fraternal twins. So in a reproductive cell, chance determines which of the 23 pairs of chromosomes goes. So there are about 8 million chromosomal organization possibilities, which means every single one of you is 1 in 8 million. You could have been very, very different. That is the possibility of 8 million different versions of you. I'm sorry, I'm seeing something in the chat. I just missed it. Did I miss it? No. While monozygotic twins are identical, fraternal twins are just like two different kids from the same parent. The only difference is they are born at the same time. So the germinal stage of prenatal development is the formation of the zygote. So it happens in 2 weeks. You absolutely have no idea whether or not you're pregnant. And this is the time when the zygote decides to stick to the uterine wall, rahim, or not. So probably every time when a sperm gets into the uterus, there is a chance for pregnancy, but the realization of pregnancy can happen if and only if the sperm meets the egg, they come together and they stick to the uterus wall. The second stage is embryonic stage. This is from 2 weeks to about 2 months, where organs begin to show their first development and the embryo begins to resemble a human being, but we're talking about something as big as this. This is still not a baby. This is still not a fetus. This is just a cluster of cells. And that's why in many countries, the deadline for abortion is 2 months. By the way, that is still very short because a woman might not really understand whether or not they are pregnant in 2 months. If they're not having morning sicknesses, if they're not having extreme hormonal changes, then the growth in the tummy begins around the 3 months. And after 2 months to birth, we have a fetus and the growth become much faster, but still you can lose the child because the attachment to the uterus might fail. And therefore, people usually do not announce their pregnancies before the 5th month, where it becomes pretty difficult to hide the pregnancy and where actually the sex of the child can be determined to a higher statistical extent. Every zygote's genetic code, every zygote, every element of prenatal development is a combination of the genetic code, so what you have brought from your parents, as well as the environmental factors that are called teratogens. Drugs, use of drugs, presence of viruses and getting ill, physical conditions such as malnutrition, stress, maybe violence in the family, air pollution, water pollution, smoking, everything can impair prenatal development. So I will need you to look at those yourselves at home, but this is an 8-week embryo. So the first things that are growing is the eye and the liver and the head, of course. This is a 12-week fetus, 3 months. 18 weeks, which is 4.5 months, we now see pretty much a resemblance of a baby. Here, by the 5th month, especially with the positioning of the baby, we can determine whether or not this child is going to be a girl or a boy, and this is a female. That's why, you go to your gynecologist monthly when you're pregnant, and in these 5th months, they would just tell you to like eat something like chocolate, because that sugar you have in your body makes the kid move, and therefore the gender of the child becomes much more visible. Sometimes they are too shy and they hide it. This is 6 months. Now we are having our eyebrows and everything. This is 7 months. It pretty much resembles a baby right now. And this is the 8 months. This 8 month kid, for example, as we see, there is a penis. So this is a male kid. You might think this positioning is very uncomfortable, but it's not because they are not, they are very comfortable in the womb. They are fed by the umbilical cord. So everything is very easy on this behalf. And generally around ninth week, ninth month, we expect birth, but it usually was seen as, that's the limit, expected limit. But right now we know that until the 14th week, which is 10 months, doctors do not intervene with the birthing process. And when it passes the 14th week, then they begin uh, trying to induce the baby. Okay, guys, this is the limit of my energy. I have to stop here. I am very sorry. Talking about this gross and fine motor skills and the rest of the material will be something we'll discuss next week. Until then, see you and bye bye.
Thank you for
And
the lesson.
you're
It
welcome.
was so much.
Thank you.